My husband, when he heard that I had not left in spite of his reiterated orders, had declined to accompany the Empress, although he had been appointed to do so. He was waiting for me to get into the carriage to follow my example, as his health would not allow him to ride. That was the reason he had been appointed to accompany the Empress. King Joseph and King Jerome remained behind to defend the city. My husband, hearing my new decision not to leave, sent me word that although in his opinion it was a mistake to abandon the national capital, the Minister of War declared it would be impossible to defend it. He added that if I persisted in remaining behind, he would come to claim his children and take them away with him, for I did not understand the risk I was running, and if my children were taken as hostages, I should be responsible for anything that might happen to them. These arguments were too convincing for me to continue to hesitate. On the other hand, I had made a promise to stay, and I did not wish to break my word. Furthermore, I was convinced that the emperor would shortly come to our rescue, and with a little courage, it would be possible for Paris to defend itself for 48 hours. Therefore, I did not leave, in spite of all the efforts that were made to have me do so. Toward nightfall, Comte Regnan de Saint-Jean d'Angely, greatly excited, came and asked me on behalf of the National Guard itself not to stay in the city. He added that the enemy had already seized the heights, that the city would doubtless be bombarded and stormed the following morning. Anything was liable to take place, and not only was I to consider myself freed from my promise, but his troops would prefer to know that I and my children were out of danger. I finally yielded, recognizing the fact at last that no one was equal to the occasion, that all had lost their heads, and one could only trust in Providence and accept its decrees. My personal relations with my husband were not the least of my worries. After all my years of domestic misery, nothing alarms me more than the thought of again being with him and being dependent on him. The idea of becoming a prisoner in the hands of strangers seemed hardly less intolerable to me than that of having to effect a reconciliation with the man who had so embittered my existence. It seemed as if he had waited for this moment to regain possession of his prey. At least that was the thought which occurred to me, for he should have accompanied the Empress, and under some pretext or other, he had avoided doing so. He had ordered his horses unharnessed and would not go away without me. One of his manservants remained on my doorstep and was to warn him the instant I prepared to leave. He seemed to attach the greatest importance to the fact of my not remaining in Paris. His uneasiness in regard to the fate of his children made this anxiety seem natural enough. Tormented by all these worries, I stepped into my carriage at 8 o'clock in the evening. Already, several hours before, I had received word that Cossacks had been seen on the Plaine de Vertus. I had accepted the offer of a lady to spend the night at her chateau near Versailles. As soon as we had passed the gate of the city, I gave orders for my groom to ride 100 paces ahead of the carriage, and if he caught sight of any Cossacks, to fire a shot in the air as a signal that the carriages were to turn back. I arrived without any trouble at Glatigny, worn out by so many varied emotions. I was undecided whether to proceed on to Rambouillet and rejoin the Empress Marie-Louise, or go to my mother at Navarre, where she doubtless had arrived. In such troublous times, irresolution is one of our chief ills. Mine sprang especially from my continual fear of encountering my husband and being obliged to go back to him. On the other hand, it is true that these domestic worries were so acute that they distracted my mind from my misfortunes, the loss of my rank and so on, or rather allowed me to face these other problems calmly. It was late when we arrived at Glatigny. I had my children put to bed immediately and threw myself down on a couch. Hardly had I secured a little rest when day began to break, and I heard the sound of cannon and even musketry from Paris. The cannon thunders, claiming its victims. I had never before heard it except in connection with public rejoicing. The frightful idea that death was overtaking my fellow countrymen so near at hand, instead of hastening my flight, made me desire to linger and at least learn what fate had overtaken this city, which had been my cradle, and all of whose inhabitants seemed suddenly dear to me. I felt, however, that my rank would not allow me to remain in a private house, and I went on to the Petit Trianon. I sent for General Preval, who commanded the cavalry depot at Versailles, and informed him of any intention of remaining there while waiting future events. At the same time, I asked him to let me know the moment there was any danger. I was well aware of the fact that it was possible for the Cossacks to arrive at the Trianon by way of the Malmaison and Bougival Road, but I trusted him to protect me. I ordered my servants not to leave the premises, and I walked about the gardens hearing the sound of firing, which filled me with anxiety. Soon, however, I was reassured as the noise stopped. Then I had at least some grounds to believe that fighting was no longer going on. After a considerable time had elapsed, I caught sight of a soldier in one of the chasseur regiments approaching on foot. He asked to speak to me privately to deliver a message from the general. His calm attitude, the fact that he was on foot, seemed in no way disturbed, made me feel his news could not be in the least alarming. Nevertheless, the general had sent him to me to say that there was not a moment to be lost, that the depot troops were leaving Versailles, the princes and marshals had already passed through the town, and within a few hours the city would be occupied by the enemy. I sent for my attendants, some of whom, in spite of my orders, had gone into Versailles. I attempted to reassure those who had remained with me as well as I could, and at last set out on the road to Rambouillet. I found it congested by carriages, soldiers, wounded, and peasant refugees. What was to become of me? Which way was I to turn? On the one hand, I was liable to fall again into the clutches of my husband. On the other, there was my mother, who seemed entirely abandoned by everyone, and who might be waiting for my arrival. Finally, there was the thought that my fate was wound up with that of a family whose head had been a father to me. Could I desert them in their distress? This last argument proved the strongest of all, and I determined to rejoin Empress Marie-Louise. I was turning over these thoughts in my mind, while my children, with the unconcern of their age, played about in the carriage and enjoyed themselves beside me as if our flight were nothing more than a game, and as if that moment their entire future was not being destroyed. I arrived very late at Rambouillet, at the moment when the princes and cabinet ministers, having rested their horses, were setting out for Chartres. They were greatly surprised to see me. My first act was to inquire what had happened in Paris. King Joseph seemed inclined to conceal the fact that the city had capitulated, but King Jerome gave me all the details and even showed me the proclamation said to have been written by the Prince of Schwarzenberg, which invited the Parisians to follow the example of the inhabitants of the city of Bordeaux, who had demanded the return of the Bourbons. They advised me not to remain an hour longer at Rambouillet, for the Cossacks would doubtless enter the town that same night. I paid little attention to their advice, considering, perhaps erroneously, that they were unduly alarmed. Moreover, it was out of the question to go on with horses that had just traveled 25 miles. I quietly sent my children to bed and was about to seek a little much-needed repose myself when an orderly with a letter from my husband was announced. The latter had passed through Versailles during the night. Furious at not finding me with the Empress, when he caught up with her, he commanded me in the harshest language to join him immediately. He added an official order to this effect signed by the Secretary of State and by the Empress herself. This letter contained such an outrageous sentence that I was infuriated by it. It settled any hesitations I might have had, and I no longer wondered whether or not I should go to stay with my mother. I wrote my husband that I had been on the point of joining the Empress Marie-Louise, but that his severity had reminded me too clearly of my former sufferings, and I intended to escape them by taking refuge with my mother. At the same time, I reassured him as to the health of his children. I also wrote the Empress and the Emperor, apologizing for my conduct and giving the true reasons for it. All these letters I turned over to the officer who had practically received orders to take me back with him as a prisoner. While I was writing these letters, I was interrupted for a moment by Colonel de Carignan, who, with his regiment, was supposed to cover the retreat of the rest of the troops, who was much perplexed as to what to do, as he could find no one qualified to issue orders. He was indignant regarding the conduct of the Minister of War, who had left without leaving any instructions. I was forced to issue them myself finally. I asked him to keep his regiment in town until I had left, and especially to inform me if his scouts caught sight of any Cossacks. This having been done, and my letters written and addressed, I was completely worn out, and was about to snatch a few moments' rest, when suddenly someone came knocking violently at my door, crying out as he did so, make haste, we must leave at once." I was sure the Cossacks were close at hand and sprang up, but it turned out to be a false alarm caused by some other travelers who were leaving, and who by mistake had knocked at my door. The chateau of Rambouillet, filled with all those people whose fears had caused them to leave Paris, had become a public hostelry open to every passerby. At dawn, the Duchess de Ragusa and the Duchess de Région, Madame de Saint-Hilaire and Madame Moulin arrived. They were greatly upset because the capital had capitulated. They told me the emperor was doubtless proceeding toward Paris, and that their husbands were prepared to die fighting beside him. After listening to 100 futile comments on the situation, I advised them not to remain any longer at Rambouillet, since the town was in danger, and I was leaving it immediately myself to go on to Navarre. My route led through the forest. I set a gamekeeper ahead of me to act as guide. Hardly had I entered the wood when one of my servants dashed up at full speed, completely out of breath, to announce that he had just caught sight of the Cossacks in the nearby plain of La Queue. I examined a map of the environs of Paris, which I had had the foresight to secure, as there was no one with me who could advise me. I saw that, taking into account the distance and time element, I was heading directly toward the enemy. I retraced my route and returned to the broad military highway. I had scarcely proceeded a mile on the road when I saw a Cossack emerge from the woods and gallop off across the plain. My groom dashed after him at full speed, and he disappeared in the woods. I had not a moment to lose in crossing the plain before the arrival of the main body of the Cossacks. Not being able to stop at Maintenon, I asked the colonel of a French regiment that fortunately happened to be there to let me have an escort to accompany me across country as far as Luya, the estate belonging to Monsieur d'Argisson, my gentleman in waiting, who with his wife had accompanied me. It was there I was planning to spend the night. At that moment, a messenger passed from whom I learned that he had just left the emperor at the Cour de France, and that the emperor was going alone with an aide-de-camp to Paris. This news affected me deeply. I imagined that Paris was about to be entirely destroyed, and that the emperor, having made desperate efforts to rescue his capital from the hands of the enemy, would perhaps succumb himself along with all those who were by his side. What a horrible thought that was! I exclaimed. If my advice had only been followed, all these disasters might have been avoided. The shock of all these thoughts threw my mind into utter confusion. Having at last arrived at Luya, I dismissed my escort, and entirely alone gave way at last to the weaknesses of my sex. As long as I had been obliged to protect the safety of my children, as long as I had been active, courage had not deserted me, but now reassured as to the fate of those beings who were particularly dear to me. I was conscious of the disaster that had befallen my country and my friends. Blood and flames seemed to be all about me. The quiet of this countryside contrasted so violently with the carnage which I imagined was taking place only a few miles off that I almost regretted the turmoil from which I had just escaped. Nevertheless, the night spent at Luya gave me a rest I needed after the fatigues of all kinds that I had lately undergone. The following morning, I arrived at the house of my mother, who, after having been so much worried and so anxious about me, was overjoyed to see me once more. She was quite as ignorant as I of what had taken place in Paris. We soon heard the facts from a servant who had managed to escape. He described the entry of the Allied armies, which he had witnessed, and spoke of the return of the Bourbons that was said to be about to take place. This information seemed to be bearable after all the horrors my imagination had conjured up. In other words, it is merely a change of dynasty, I said. Well, as long as France does not suffer, we must not mind if we are sacrificed. The calamity thus appeared less serious than I had thought it would be, and my nerves became calmer. But when we heard that among the young women who had hastened most eager to greet the foreign invaders, there were several who had belonged to the Empress's own household, we were deeply grieved that well-born French ladies should behave in a manner which would have made women of the most common class blush. Our national honor was never dearer to me than in these moments when it was shamed under the very eyes of the enemy. The entourage of the Prince of Benevento, Talleyrand, had been, as I learned later, the hotbed of this revolution. For a long time, he had been in relations with all the enemies of France through the Princess de Colonne and the Duc d'Alberg. He had taken care to have himself arrested at the gate the day he was pretending to follow the Empress, and he had spent the night at the house of the Duc de Ragusa, doubtless encouraging him to commit those acts of treason, which took place the following day. The Duke, in making his troops capitulate, had dared name as one of his conditions that the life of the Emperor, whose cause his surrender overthrew, should be spared. Consequently, he was fully conscious of the importance of these acts. How shameful to bargain with the enemy for the life of your commanding officer. Why was he not at his side fighting with him? We awaited news of the Emperor with the greatest anxiety. It was at the court of France that he heard of the capitulation of Paris. Alone and without troops, he could not proceed, and he returned to Fontainebleau. Monsieur de Moisson, one of the accountants employed by the Duc de Bassano, was the first to give my mother news of what had taken place. In the middle of the night, she entered my room and, all in tears, threw herself on my bed as she exclaimed, "Poor, poor Napoleon. He is being sent to the island of Elba. How unhappy he will be. If it were not for his wife, I should go and shut myself up with him." I saw how deeply she still loved him and thought bitterly how much courage she had needed in order to leave his side. Monsieur de Moisson gave us additional details regarding the tragic events which had taken place. During his narrative, my mother's attention seemed absorbed only by the Emperor's misfortunes. His fate grieved us deeply, but so far as I personally was concerned, the news that the Bourbons had been recalled to the throne of France, that peace was about to be signed, that the nation as a whole seemed contented, and that we did not have to bewail the loss of any of those whom we loved. All this appeared a happy solution compared with the disasters I had feared a short time before. It is easy enough to console oneself for the loss of wealth and of a royal crown. Human mishaps carry with them the power of ennobling the soul of the person on whom they fall. That soul becomes proud and contented beneath their blows. It is no longer wounded by them, and it seems as though one's moral stature grew as one's social position decreased. Always inclined to be hasty in making my decisions, I already concluded that I had lost all my possessions in France, that the only fortune I now owned was my diamonds, and that with them I should go off to Martinique and settle down there in a little house which still belonged to my mother. How glad I was to have instilled in my children from their earliest years those principles which fortify men against the vicissitudes of life. I took advantage of the present circumstance to accustom them not to count on anything except what they could obtain by their own efforts. I found a kind of pleasure in depicting our lot to them in the darkest colors, and ended up by saying with a smile, "My children, you are nobodies now. No longer do you possess kingdoms or principalities or dukedoms. Perhaps it is best for you that this should have happened, but in order to make it so, you must be obedient and work hard." Already when the enemy drew near, in order to make them share in the public misfortunes, I had suppressed their dessert at dinner, and they had accepted this little privation very willingly. "Now again," my son replied, "Mama, if you want me to, I'll be a soldier, and someday, perhaps I'll be a colonel." "Alas," I answered, deeply moved, "perhaps you will never be able to fight for France." "If that is so, Mama," he answered immediately, "I shall never fight against France." My only answer was to pick him up and kiss him. His brother inquired if he could no longer have his wooden rocking horse. I told him he must give it up, and he never mentioned it again. Mademoiselle Cochelet, to whom I mentioned my idea of taking refuge in Martinique, made me promise to keep her with me no matter what became of me. She and Monsieur de Moisson went off to Paris to attend to my affairs there. Although we were always anxious to obtain further details regarding the Emperor, we had only such news as was to be found in the newspapers, which a groom who had remained at Malmaison forwarded to us. These papers were so filled with insulting remarks about the Emperor that the Empress felt indignant as well as wounded by their attitude. Let them accuse him of being too fond of glory, of being too ambitious, but at least they should not slander him about other matters regarding which I know more than anyone else, she exclaimed, and she went on to explain warmly all the misstatements contained in the papers.